Thank you so much, Sarah. Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. Today's webinar is labeled The Incinerator Lobby's Push to Co-op Climate and Zero Waste Financing. And this webinar is brought to you by the Ironbound Community Corporation, Friends of the Earth US, and the Global Alliance for Incinerator Alternatives. My name is Marcel Howard, and I'm the Zero Waste Program Manager for the US-Canada region at Gaia, again, the Global Alliance for Incinerator Alternatives, and I will be your moderator for today. We have a fascinating panel for today's webinar, which will dive deeper into how the incinerator lobby works hard to co-opt climate and zero waste financing to stay afloat. This webinar is the second in a series of webinars unpacking the false solutions that is incineration. And that includes chemical recycling, gasification, pyrolysis, waste to energy, and pretty much every other name that industry has developed to push this false solution of waste burning as a solution to our increasing waste crisis. Our next webinar will actually be focused on life after incineration and how to embrace a zero waste future. And this will take place towards the end of March, and more information on that webinar is to come. So please stay tuned for more information there. Now, before jumping into introductions of panelists today, I do want to just ground us in the reasoning why we developed this webinar series in the first place. Now, incinerators are one of the most toxic, expensive, dangerous, and climate polluting industries out there. Falsely advertised as a solution to our waste crisis that stems from overproduction and consumption. Incinerators not only deter funding from strategies that offer real solutions, but are manifestations of environmental racism. The most affected by their negative impacts are the least responsible for a waste crisis: low wealth communities, communities of color, indigenous communities, and other marginalized communities as well. Incinerators emit 68% more greenhouse gases per unit of energy than coal plants. And despite being a major contributor to climate change, the incinerator industry stays afloat by relying on renewable energy credits, costly subsidies, and externalized costs. Now, the Treasury Department is beginning to determine whether incineration should qualify as a quote unquote zero emissions technology under the 45Y Clean Electricity Production Tax Credit. This is a part of the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, if they determine it falls under this category, this would open up billions of dollars in funding for the incineration lobby through the IRA. Thus, the main goal of this webinar series is to really mobilize and educate the wider anti-incineration and zero waste movements and preparation for engaging with Treasury on the 45Y decision, which we expect to begin taking shape over the next few months. They are currently still making a decision or in their public comment period phase for the 45V tax credit focused on hydrogen. So today, as mentioned, we will dive a little bit deeper into sort of how the incinerator lobby sort of stays afloat through these tax credits. We'll discuss a little bit about next-gen incinerators as well, or what we call next-gen incinerators, or what the industry is necessarily calling next-gen incinerators. And we'll look at the specifics around those additional tax credits and subsidies as well. So now that we've grounded ourselves in the reasoning behind this webinar, let me introduce our speakers for today's webinar. First up, we have John Victor Andasan. John was born in the Philippines until they immigrated in 1997 to Long Beach, California. They lived there for about 5 years, where they attended Daniel Webster Elementary. They moved to Carson in South Bay area, where they got involved with student organizing against the use of alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs. They went to the University of California, where they received a Bachelor of Arts in Asian American Studies with a concentration in Filipino studies. And during their tenure at UCLA, they were involved with organizing students of color, LGBTQ issues, and various issues affecting underrepresented communities. John serves as the Long Beach and South Bay community organizer for the past 9 years at the East Yards Communities for Environmental Justice, and helped to build out a fossil fuel and refinery work with community members from the first ever West Long Beach bike toxic tours to suing refineries and winning. In the transition to their 10th year at East Yards for Communities for Environmental Justice, they now serve as the fundraising and development director to ensure East Yards has funds to operate and continue to do the work on the ground with the community to build people's power. Next, we have Cynthia Palmer. Cynthia serves as the senior petrochemical analyst for Mom's Clean Air Force, working to protect frontline communities, workers, and the climate from the dangers of plastics production and incineration. Her training is in environmental and occupational health and law. Cynthia's prior positions include directing a nonprofit's pesticides division, helping draft global toxic chemicals treaties, editing an environmental health and climate news service, and protecting workers from radiation, beryllium, and other harmful exposures in the nuclear weapons complex. And last but certainly not least, we have Sarah Lutz. Sarah is a climate campaigner at Friends of the Earth USA, where she works to ensure that polluters aren't able to co opt federal climate policy incentives. Her work centers around fighting false climate solutions, including biomass, carbon capture and storage, and nuclear. Before this role, Sarah was the operations assistant at Friends of the Earth, and Sarah received her Master's of Arts in Environmental Security at George Washington University, and her bachelor's in science and her bachelor's in political science economics at the University of the Pacific. In her spare time, she enjoys hiking up the closest mountain and biking everywhere as well. Again, we are super excited to hear from our panelists for today. And so as our panelists speak, please feel free to drop your questions into the chat, and we will try to answer them, as many of them as we can during our Q&A session, which will be towards the end of the webinar. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and pass it over to John to get us started. And John, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And I think I'll wait till the screen gets shared. There. Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. And also, okay, it just says Sarah, I'll wait for a bit. Deals? Oh.
Can everyone see the screen with the presentation?
Okay, cool. I think it took a second to load. Yes, give us a thumbs up, a confirm before I continue. It should say grassroots power building, combating false solutions. Okay, I see thumbs up. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Hello, my name is Jan Victor Andasan. My gender pronouns are they, them, and a Tagalog word, siya and sila, which are all gender inclusive. And as Marcel introduced, I work with ECR Communities for Environmental Justice. But before I talk more about myself, I want to ground us on where I am zooming from. This is the geographical map where ECR Communities for Environmental Justice organizes in, which many of y'all know as so-called Los Angeles, particularly Long Beach, Southeast LA, East LA, and what we know before European colonization are Tongva territories. The Tongva peoples are they're not a federally recognized tribe, but they are the indigenous people whose ancestral homelands covers parts of so-called Los Angeles, going into parts of what we know as Orange County, up into the mountains of Los Angeles. And this is actually the geographical map of where I organize in, with a focus on the Long Beach, Carson, Wilmington area. And if you don't know which land you're on, I think you can just put like nativeland.com on Google and it'll link you, because it's important to know which ancestral homelands of the indigenous people we reside on, and to really ground ourselves on how we can walk in a good way. And like I said, my name is Jan Victor Andasan. I'm an immigrant from the Philippines, and I'm not only a staff at ECR Communities for Environmental Justice, I'm also a member. If you met the staff that we have, most of our staff don't just serve within the role that we are hired for at ECR. We actually participate beyond our role because many, if not almost all of the staff live and work and play and pray in the communities we organize in. So while for the past 9 years, I served as the organizer in the Long Beach South Bay area, I also have grown up and lived in that neighborhood, which is really important because it's a very unique situation to have an overwhelming majority of your staff be in the communities that they represent, and not just because of work, but many of us lived and grew up there. And so today, I'm talking about the work that ECR Communities for Environmental Justice does, which is an organization that uses the 501c3 structure to build power in our region. And that's really important. I want to make that distinction, right? We utilize the 501c3 structure, knowing that we're working within a system that continues to not prioritize the community health of Black and brown working class residents. And in our struggle and in the ways that we've done work, the way we ground our work is we ask these three questions, because I don't know everything. Marcel and Sarah and Cynthia, I'm sure I would not say they know everything, but they know their expertise. I know my expertise, and together we know a lot. And that is how this panel has come about. And similarly, how ECR organizes is that I don't know everything as an organizer, but I know what I know from organizing to my schooling to the experiences I have, and the community members have this knowledge. And together we ask these three particular questions on what is it, how does it affect us, and what can we do? And what is it is really broad. It could be anything. And in this context, we're talking about incineration or fall solution. How does it affect us? It's built next to our neighborhood. It's affecting the air we breathe. Incineration is affecting our reproductive bodies. It's giving us, health issues like asthma. And then what can we do is, in part, this is a piece of it, right? What can we do is ensure that no more resources or money go to incineration. But also, before this moment, years earlier, what can we do was, what can we do is shut down the incinerator, which you'll learn a little bit about. And so I'm going to go right into the next slide. And I want to give you all some history, because there were 3 incinerators in California. 2 of them have actually since then shut down, and 2 of them are based out in the regions that ECR organizes in. And the two incinerators that were shut down were a direct result of community members engaging in the decision making that either starved out the money that went into incinerators so that they had to close. Actually, those are both the same reasons why they closed. We starved out the money that allowed these incinerators to stay operating, because, as Marcel said, they are, and I don't even want to use the word profitable, they are not an efficient way and an efficient use of the funds that we have for the true solutions we need to address the climate impact. And so there's this map, if you see, of where the yellow incinerator that we know as the Commerce incinerator on the top, and on the bottom is the closer to the ports is the Surf incinerator, which is based out in Long Beach. And so they claimed it as they burn trash, created energy. Burning trash to make energy already sounds like, that doesn't sound like a smart idea. And community members knew that. And so before we actually fully built out our zero waste work, there were community members that were affected by commerce and worked with the previous executive director and then a former zero waste organizer on engaging with it, and worked with elected officials to really push back that we shouldn't invest funds in these. And in their education, it was really because they were learning about what incineration actually does in the community. We're often told that we don't want to throw in landfill, so let's burn it. And now we're burning trash, but we're making energy. And at that time, they were getting credits. And so we worked with an elected official in California that eventually shut the incinerator down. And I'm so sorry, I didn't put the year in, around 2016, 2017. And that would be the impetus for us to discuss other opportunities to think about zero waste. That didn't actually lead into let's shut down the other incinerator in Long Beach. It led into more conversations around waste and incineration, which is what I mean when we're talking about grassroots power building. And why does that matter? Why do I want to talk about grassroots power building and waste? LA and Long Beach combined have the largest ports in the country. When I first started in 2014, there was a statistic that it was the 9th largest port in the world combined. And now I think it's in the top 5 of the largest ports combined in the world. And those are all the goods that eventually in its life cycle, right? Like you take, let's just say like this notebook, and you don't keep it at the very end. You bought it from somewhere. This was made in China. And eventually at the end of the life cycle, after you use it, and if you decide not to keep it, you might throw it in the trash. And it either ends up in a landfill or gets burned or something that probably isn't healthy. And so we, as community members and staff, started to realize that it wasn't just about the Commerce incinerator. It was the idea that there was this massive system feeding each other that was creating the need for landfills, incinerators to address the harms of the consumption, right? And it's not to put all the blame on consumers, but that it's how items are made. And unfortunately, where we are, we have the largest ports that bring in all those goods. And so we started to draw the connections on how these systems were connected. And even more so, we even started to draw the connections on how our food was connected. So while we just shut down the Commerce Incinerator, we were actually building out our ways to try to reduce our impact with goods movement, which is where a product is made to where it is bought, sold, and consumed, and then the end life cycle. And one of the things that came up around that time for members was how to access food, and even what do you do with the food after it's done. And so community members, were being enticed with the offer to build a Walmart in their neighborhood. And some folks, some working class Black and brown folks were like, yes, Walmart. But then other folks were like, we know Walmart is bad. And then the question that was framed was, well, why do we need a Walmart? Walmart wasn't the need. The need was access to produce, access to the materials we need to survive, to live. And so those were kind of the impetus of the conversations on how we connected the impacts of goods movement to our needs as community members living in predominantly polluted neighborhoods, to what we consumed and to where it is disposed of. And so the solution that came about was to create our own decentralized garden. And this garden was actually the start of the conversation for why we would fight the second incinerator we would work to shut down, which is the Long Beach, oh my gosh, I always, Surf Incinerator Southeast Reclaim and Refuse Facility. I always forget the name because it's like, it's too long. And I don't want to remember its name because I need it out of here. And so in these conversations, as we talked about gardening, we started to talk about waste. We started to talk about how we manage not just the organic waste, but other waste that was coming into our neighborhood. And this is our youth that engaged in those conversations. They, at the beginning, were just like, well, why does it matter? Until they started to take an item and think about the entire life cycle, right, of where it is bought and made. And so if we didn't grow our own produce, most of our food comes from other places. Sometimes they're even wrapped in plastic, which is so unnecessary. Why are you wrapping produce in plastic? And then we use it, throw away the plastic. And then once we're done with, let's say, the shell of this kabocha squash, where does the shell, right? Where does the outer layer go? And so all of these conversations led to our community members starting to think, well, so how do we mitigate that? What is our responsibility? How do we organize so that we are less complicit in adding to the waste that is harming our families? And so that's when we started to learn about surf and its connection to the waste that we consumed. But also what we realized is surf didn't just manage the waste in Long Beach. It actually took in waste from other parts of California and sometimes even other states. And so just a few statistics that we learned as we started to build our power and understanding of the system was that 40% of the waste sent to Long Beach, of the city's waste was sent to Long Beach Incinerator in 2017, even though 90% of the trash sent to landfills and incinerators could be recycled, reused, or composted. And I think there was a statistic that an overwhelming majority of the material sent to this incinerator was organic, which means we could have composted it. And it is the third largest greenhouse gas emitting facility in Long Beach. Also acknowledging this is paired with the ports, the Port of Long Beach, Port of LA, and the refineries. And so we were putting in so much money to just keep this facility afloat. And so more conversations happened and community members were like, this doesn't make sense. We shouldn't be putting money to keeping an operation that isn't actually addressing an issue and it's harming us. And so with our partners from Earth Justice, there was this report that came out where we started thinking about, well, what are the policies that we could introduce? And so Earth Justice came out with this report called Vestiges of Environmental Racism. At the time, there were still 2 incinerators operating, the one in Long Beach, and then the second one in Stanislaus. And so this was the work that we would take statewide to be able to shut it down. And as a result of this report, we introduced AB 1857, which ties in perfectly to why this panel and why this conversation is really important, which was AB 1857 would remove the diversion credit from municipal solid waste incinerators and redefine incineration as disposal. Burning trash is not recycling or reducing our waste, and the bill stops that false narrative. So as a result of everything the community members were learning about goods movement, growing their own produce and addressing their needs through true solutions, we realized we couldn't feed the beast if we weren't participating in our own individual actions, as well as their city, statewide, and collective actions. And And so eventually we would introduce the bill with Valley Improvement Project, Earth Justice, and Californians Against Waste. And it would pass, and I think the next slide, it would pass September 16, 2022. And because of this bill passing, Covanta, which operated the SERP incinerator in Long Beach, would be bleeding so much money. They would bleed so much money, and it would be so ineffective to operate that they would have to shut down. And can we get some hypes, y'all? Because Covanta, the SERP incinerator, had to stop operating January 31st, 2024. That means it stopped operating less than a month ago after years of work with so many groups. And I want to recognize the labor not only ECR did, but so many others, right? And so that one bill cut the credits, but the credits, it wasn't just about the credits. It was about the organizing it took for residents to understand how they can mediate on the problem. And so this is why we're here, is that as we talk about where credits are going federally, but also in the state, we have to think about how do we build the power to engage. And I'm going to share as I close off this part of the panel, and definitely I'm excited to hear more from the other panelists and the questions, is that oftentimes we talk about the policies were the wins or the climate investments that are coming in. And USC just did a study that came out February, I want to say 14th. I think that's what it says on the website, on how climate investments were all truly a result of the community work addressing environmental racism and climate injustice. And that these funds that now are accessible is because of the groundwork that folks on the ground in community groups, in EJ groups, indigenous folks fought to criticize false solutions and get the investments to true solutions. And as I'm about to close off, I want to invite that now we're fighting to keep incinerators, to shut down incinerators and to make sure they don't transition into a false solution. And that includes insert whatever false solution, because there's way too many. But some of the big things, and I think Marcel added onto it, was around hydrogen. And hydrogen is a piece that's directly tied to incineration that we're all going to have to interrogate and mediate, because there's solutions that are packaged as it's better than that other solution that was bad. And now we have this. But what we know as communities, when we learn about what these solutions are and how it affects us, including how it affects our bodies, our communities, and other neighbors, right? When we shut down the SERP incinerator, it wasn't just about us. We knew that it was a collective issue, and we were trying to shut it down for our communities, but other neighborhoods would be affected too. And so what does it look like for us to transition into new solutions that aren't false, but also what systems do we create to mediate the fact that we're going to have to manage our trash somewhere else? And so this is just a little tidbit on how we built power and how we built power on the ground, introduced legislation, and eventually won. But the win doesn't stay a win unless we basically manage and oversee what happens after, because right now they're working to transition SERP into a solution that's also going to be a false solution and still affect our communities and potentially other neighborhoods. Check.
Thank you so much, John. That is brilliant. Really appreciate those insights, and we'll keep the panelists going. Next, we will move on to Cynthia Palmer. Cynthia, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And congratulations, John, Victor, on the wins. Amazing. So my name is Cynthia Palmer, and I work as the Senior Analyst for Petrochemicals at Mom's Clean Air Force. I've been asked to talk about next generation incineration technologies. But as was suggested earlier, next gen is a bit of a misnomer, as these technologies are not actually new. These incinerators have been around for decades, but now they are being repackaged as a solution to the plastic crisis. Slide 2, please. So let's spend a minute talking about plastics before we dive into its disposal. The world wars of the 1900s saw a massive US government investment in the development and production of chemical warfare agents, synthetic rubbers, and other petrochemical products. And thanks to the vast subsidies and tax breaks from Uncle Sam, by the end of World War II, the commercial plastics industry was well positioned to grow exponentially. They had the pipelines, ports, production facilities. All they needed was a market for their plastics and other petrochemicals, something that they have been developing over the past 70 years. Slide 3, please. So plastics are made by combining fossil fuel polymers and synthetic chemicals, over 13,000 chemicals to be exact, many of which are carcinogenic, flammable, and explosive. They harm people along the entire supply chain, especially people in underserved and overburdened communities. Next slide, please. Nearly half of plastics produced are single-use plastics, and the industry is on track to triple production by 2050. Next slide, please. There is no safe and effective way to get rid of plastic. China used to import 70% of US plastic waste and 95% of European plastic waste. With our trade imbalance, China would send us machinery, toys, textiles, furniture, and on the return voyage, they filled their empty ships with American trash. And that all stopped in January of 2018, when China announced that they were no longer willing to take our garbage. So plastics trash has become more visible and more uncomfortable for Americans. It's no longer out of sight, out of mind. Also, people are finding out the truth that plastics are harmful to humans at every stage of their supply chain and to wildlife, and that plastics recycling does not work. Next slide, please. So this is a snapshot from EPA of what gets burned in municipal waste combustors as of 2018, just to give us a sense of what's in the waste stream. This is EPA's most recent data, but it's 6 years old. So you see that officially the waste stream that gets burned includes 16% plastics by weight. But when you look at the categories, some of which I've circled, you realize that the number was actually closer to 30% back in 2018, because many materials, the leathers, the rubbers, the textiles, are largely made from plastics too. And even paper envelopes have plastic windows these days. So some of these other numbers should also say plastic too. And the number in the waste stream as of 2018, the proportion of plastics was actually closer to 30. The proportion of plastics in the waste stream now is undoubtedly higher. And the more plastics we use, the more toxic the municipal waste stream becomes. Next slide, please. So the plastics industry is desperate for a magic bullet to make plastic waste disappear and to do it cheaply. So what they've done is rebrand an old incineration technology called pyrolysis as something new, eco-friendly, good for the climate. They are calling it advanced recycling or chemical recycling, or all the other terms that you see on the screen. Next slide, please. And pyrolysis technologies are not actually new. They were used by ancient cultures to make charcoal. And one of the modern day pioneers of pyrolysis incineration was Walt Disney, who in 1980 began construction of a pyrolysis incinerator at Disney World in Florida, with the goal of burning garbage to produce steam to power the theme park. But unfortunately, Disney quickly realized that this system was way too expensive, energy intensive, inefficient, and the product was scrapped almost immediately. So the next slide you're going to see is just a 30-second video from Moms Clean Air Force, my organization, about these chemical recycling technologies. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this slide here just gives a couple examples so you see what they look like. Down below is the Brightmark facility in Ashley, Indiana. This is a pyrolysis incinerator. They've had multiple fires and mechanical difficulties. And on the upper right is the Pure Cycle Ironton chemical recycling facility in Ohio, a solvent-based chemical recycling facility. And then slide 11, next slide, please. And currently there are 11 of these chemical recycling facilities in the US, though not all of them are operational. The plastics industry is planning to build 150 of them. Next slide, please. So this slide has way too much information, but essentially it shows that pyrolysis incinerators, the chemical recycling, transforms plastic trash into air pollution and hazardous waste and dirty fuel. The air pollution includes some of the most toxic chemicals known to humankind, like dioxins. The hazardous waste is produced in vast quantities. The amounts can be as high as 1 ton of hazardous waste produced for every 3 tons of plastic waste that go into the facility. So it's a 3-to-1 input-output ratio, which is not very good. And the pyrolysis oils are also produced, and those can be made into heavily contaminated fuels. The cancer risk from some of these fuels is astronomically high. And in one case, we know from Mississippi, it is expected to cause cancer in every person exposed over a lifetime. Next slide, please. So I apologize if anyone is having flashbacks from high school chemistry class, but here's a little chart comparing the temperature and the oxygen levels in municipal waste incinerators and in these advanced recycling pyrolysis incinerators. And what is worth noting is that the conditions in the right-hand column, the advanced recycling pyrolysis incinerators, are just about optimal for the production of dioxins, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and other products of incomplete combustion. In other words, extremely toxic air pollutants. The other interesting thing is that even though these operating conditions are so extremely dangerous, and even though These pyrolysis incinerators are used for plastics, which are the very most toxic component of the waste stream. Nonetheless, the industry is trying to exempt this category of incinerators from all air pollution laws. Next slide, please. So here is the applicable provision of the Clean Air Act. Section 129 regulates solid waste incinerators. So the plastics industry is trying to exempt its plastic incinerators by claiming that plastic waste is not solid waste and that plastics incineration is not incineration. So they are arguing that plastics incineration is actually a form of recycling or manufacturing. Next slide, please. And for the plastics industry, there are significant advantages in rebranding plastics burning as not solid waste incineration. I'll just mention a couple of them. They would save a lot of money by not investing in pollution controls, because pollution controls are super expensive. And second, they would shed the incinerator label, which would be a public relations victory. Nobody wants an incinerator in their backyard, but communities are eager to bring in manufacturing. Next slide, please. So the plastics industry has so far convinced 25 states to pass laws reclassifying these incinerators as manufacturing, recycling, or anything other than incinerators in order to exempt these facilities from air pollution regulations under the Clean Air Act. Federal clean air law preempts state laws. It overrides the state laws. So now it is up to the EPA and Congress to decide whether to exempt these incinerators from the Clean Air Act. Next slide, please. So these are just some references for my images. And next slide, please. Here is one of my favorite cartoons about plastic. That's all. Thank you so much.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Cynthia. Really appreciate it. And we will move it right on to Sarah following next, and so we can have enough time for Q&A. So Sarah will take it away.
Hey everyone, thank you, Marcel. And thank you to the other panelists. I wanted to do a little bit of a deep dive today on incinerators' federal strategy. So, as incinerators across states and counties are shutting down and losing their long-held preferential treatment and subsidies, they have been very aggressively lobbying on the federal level to embed themselves in a new generation of subsidies. We were able to recover a number of documents and email exchanges that provided some very good insight into Covanta's federal strategy, and I'll go over with them with y'all today. I've peppered a couple of quotes from our investigation throughout this presentation, but broadly, Covanta's strategy can be broken down into 4 main categories. The first is that Covanta is working really hard to portray incineration as clean energy. They rely on a number of gimmicks, including modeling that only compares incineration to this, very narrow, no action scenario where all waste goes into the landfill with no diversion and no climate-friendly practices. Under this inaccurately narrow model, they try to argue that burning trash for energy is comparatively cleaner. This is patently untrue, but has allowed incineration to be bundled with actual renewable energy for a long time. We also uncovered conversations about how inserting incineration into one policy could be leveraged to gain more favorable consideration in other federal policies. So, a consideration of incineration as clean electricity has implications for what clean hydrogen is, like John mentioned. Lobbyists are using their grip that they have on local officials and incinerator communities to make it appear to Congress that there is local support for this industry. We uncovered a number of meetings where Covanta brought in a county official to meetings with their congressman or with the EPA, an attempt to portray local support for this new incinerator subsidy. In reality, the community had never been contacted and often had no idea that there was this potential shift in federal policy that would have thrown their incinerator another lifeline. Additionally, the local officials in incinerator communities discussed the potential of using a federal determination that incineration is clean to reinvigorate their advocacy for more favorable state treatment. So we saw this conversation occurring around the Long Beach incinerator, talking about, reinvigorating their advocacy to get incineration re-included as a diversion tactic. And finally, Covanta is attempting to co-opt zero waste terminology, such as, branding a coalition, a circular economy coalition, or rebranding incineration under new names like Cynthia discussed. So there are a couple of really important federal policies that the incinerator lobbyists have been targeting over the next, and will be targeting over the next few years. The first is the 45Y Clean Electricity Tax Credit. This tax credit was created by the Inflation Reduction Act and will be replacing our long-held renewable tax credit that unfortunately created a carve-out for incineration. Under this new clean electricity tax credit, we have the great opportunity to exclude incineration and a number of other false solutions from this subsidy. And the second big policy is the renewable fuel standard, potentially expanding into electricity. And as you can see here, Covanta sees these two policies in particular to be very interrelated. Any positive federal determination in one will have huge implications for the other. So let's do a quick deep dive here. For those unfamiliar, the Clean Electricity Tax Credit is a so-called zero emission tax credit. Instead of awarding credits to particular technologies that we know to be renewable, it will go to any and all electricity generation that can demonstrate itself to have zero emissions over its life cycle. Now, normally, a shift from calling something renewable to technology neutral would be setting off all kinds of alarm bells for me. There are technologies like incineration that we know are bad for the environment and communities, and those should be explicitly excluded from our climate funding. Oftentimes, a technology neutral policy is actually designed to be a backdoor for bundling false solutions with renewables. But luckily, that does not appear to be the case with this new clean electricity tax credit. We have a pretty strong definition of life cycle emissions, and Treasury will have every opportunity to do the right thing with its implementation of this credit and exclude incineration and a number of other harmful energy production methods that have long held a carve-out in our previous tax credits. A couple other changes with this tax credit is that it's transferable and has options for direct pay. So transferable credits can be bought or sold. It makes the credit more attractive to project developers that may not have significant tax burden, but it means they can sell these credits and monetize them that way. And direct pay means that tax-exempt organizations like states or local governments can still receive this credit. There's also a bonus in this credit that gets bumped up an additional 10% if the project is located in an energy community. In theory, this was intended to help direct renewable investment into communities that would have borne, historically have borne pollution from fossil infrastructure. However, if this tax credit is not implemented well, and if dirty energy like incineration were able to qualify, the bonus would actually completely backfire and end up further incentivizing the targeting of communities for more polluting projects. So it is extremely important that Treasury and the Biden administration get this tax credit correct. So how do we engage? What's next? This tax credit is overseen by Treasury and the IRS, which are not traditionally agencies that make these types of important environmental determinations. So we expect important decision makers and influence coming directly from the White House, as well as EPA and DOE in determining, how this credit will be implemented. Some important things to watch are making sure that Treasury and IRS are measuring the full life cycle emissions on a climate relevant time frame, and that they're modeling any baseline alternatives against real zero waste policies. So incinerators are not allowed to pretend that the only other option besides burning is landfilling. The other important policy coming up in the next couple of years is the renewable fuel standard. Now, for those not familiar, this is a biofuel program that largely focuses on mandating a certain amount of liquid biofuels are blended with our gas. Mostly that is ethanol. However, there's been conversation over the past few years to expand this program into electricity used to charge our electric vehicles as that industry continues to grow. This is a really dangerous slippery slope. True renewables like wind and solar cannot participate in the renewable fuel standard. Only electricity from sources like burning trash, wood, or methane biogas will be likely to qualify, which makes it a huge boon for the incinerator industry, the loggers, and factory farm owners who are the huge coalition that are teaming up to advocate for this expansion. And it's not small change here. Covanta estimated that this expansion could be worth $3 million annually for just a single incinerator facility. So this is a very important policy to them. Luckily, there was some really amazing solidarity between activists fighting factory farms with woody biomass groups and incinerator groups that were able to beat back this proposal last year. That was a huge victory. The Biden administration had been planning this expansion since their first day in office. And, we were able to get it removed between the draft rule proposal and the final proposal, which is not something you see often. That was a big uphill battle and an amazing success. But we expect for that fight to have to occur again next year as the EPA gets ready to issue another rulemaking on the renewable fuel standard. Some important things to watch for that rulemaking will be pretty similar to the clean electricity rulemaking, making sure that the full life cycle emissions are calculated and that any baseline alternatives are set against best practices and not artificially narrow. There are a couple of important other distinctions to watch out for. The first is that under the renewable fuel standard, the emissions bar is much lower. So for the clean electricity tax credit, incinerators would have to figure out how they're going to pretend they're zero emission. For the renewable fuel standard, they only need to come up with modeling that demonstrates they are 60% cleaner than petroleum. They should still be excluded under this standard, but it decreases how much mental gymnastics they'll need to come up with for a friendly model. Additionally, the impact of qualification under the renewable fuel standard is potentially more immediate than the tax credit. While the new clean electricity tax credit would only be directed at new or expanded incinerator facilities, the renewable fuel standard does not have that restriction. So any and all incinerators would be able to immediately generate these lucrative credits under the renewable fuel standard. And finally, while the clean electricity tax credit is hinged solely on emissions, the renewable fuel standard does provide the opportunity for EPA to consider co-pollution and other impacts on the community. We saw a disappointingly superficial environmental justice analysis when EPA tried proposing an electricity pathway last year, and it'll be important moving forward that they conduct a more in-depth and accurate analysis. So that was a lot of information. Thank you for your attention. Happy to answer any questions. I did want to point out we've got a couple of really great resources that I'll also share in the chat. We've teamed up with Gaia and ICC to come up with some fact sheets that are specific to California and New Jersey. I can also share together some comments that we've created with Gaia and some other groups about how 45Y can and should exclude incineration, as well as a news article about our investigation into Covanta's federal strategy. So I will end it there. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. And just wanted to thank our amazing panelists once again for your great presentations with a lot of rich information. So thank you again so much for that. We do have a couple of minutes. I think we were just under about 5 minutes or so for questions. We will be able to share emails with the speakers for additional questions for folks if we don't get to them. But we do have a few questions in the chat and in our Q&A. So let me just, I'll read them out and feel free to whoever would like to tackle the question, feel free to jump in. I will tackle this first one though. It's will you be talking about the Chevron case in the Supreme Court? This is Chevron deference, or the Chevron document or doctrine, excuse me. For those of you that aren't aware, this case is on the Chevron doctrine. It's essentially the Supreme Court is hearing a case on this, and this doctrine is essentially administrative law principle that compels federal courts to defer to a federal agency's interpretation of an ambiguous or unclear statute that Congress has delegated to that agency. So essentially, the federal government can, EPA can sort of say, okay, this particular piece here refers to this, and this is how we're going to implement it, and this is our interpretation of it. It gives a lot of power to the federal government in that regard, and there's a huge attempt to overturn that power, which will make it a lot difficult for agencies within the federal government to actually interpret and implement certain laws and regulations coming their way. So we didn't talk about it this time around, but that's definitely something on our radar and will affect our wider movement and the work that we all do in this space. Our next question is about Covanta. So from Kevin is, how did you get Covanta's individual facility or faculty financial reports, since that combines all information on their annual reports? And does this mean Covanta can be receiving 2 different credits? Sarah, you want to take a stab at that one?
Yeah, if I'm understanding the question correctly, what we actually ended up doing is we submitted a series of Freedom of Information Acts and public records requests. And that's where, we were able to find all the email exchanges and information I referenced in my presentation. They do present Covanta with the option to censor financial information, but one of the things that we were lucky enough to find was, this exchange about how much qualification could be worth to that particular incinerator facility, and that information wasn't censored, and so that's how we were able to get that information. But yeah, highly recommend public records requests. If you know who's involved in these conversations, they're pretty simple to put together, and you can get some really great information that's not necessarily public.
Thanks, Sarah. And just so on that, last thing I'll note is that we actually uncovered, it might have been mentioned earlier, but we actually uncovered the fact that Covanta sees this 45Y as an opportunity, and if it were to if incineration were to be classified as zero emissions at the federal level, they are going to use that to their advantage at the state level as well. They've already put that out there about California, that they're hoping that this goes their way so they can push back on California policies as well. So really important to keep an eye on those FOIAs. We have another question related to the renewable fuel standard at the state level. Do you foresee low carbon fuel standards as providing an avenue, excuse me, for subsidies for incinerators in a similar way? Does anyone have any thoughts there?
I mean, I guess from a federal perspective, and I absolutely invite John or someone else to jump in with more of a California perspective, but I don't believe incineration counts as renewable electricity under California's definition, in which case I don't think they would be able to qualify under the LCFS. But maybe some of the new next gen buzzword terminology might sneak in there. I don't know enough about California policy to say with certainty there. So Cynthia, I don't know if you have thoughts.
Yeah, not really.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you. I think we have time for just one more question. Just trying to see the chat. Where is it? Sorry, folks. Neil will be the last question we'll take. It's so several civic and environmental justice groups around the U.S. have developed transition plans from incinerators. They have developed detailed plans for shutting down the incinerator and moving towards zero waste. Is there a similar effort to develop a transition plan for shutting down garbage incinerators in New Jersey? I just moved to New Jersey and want to assist in these efforts. I can actually speak to that. Neil, there is a big push, particularly from the Ironbound Community Corporation. A lot of the work that's taking place throughout the state of New Jersey, specifically in Ironbound, they are working to close down that incinerator, that Caventa incinerator, and one of their main focus areas is to do a huge shift to zero waste. And so they're working on closing that incinerator first by propelling and pushing zero waste strategies for the solution to that waste crisis once that incinerator facility is closed down. So there's definitely a lot of folks in New Jersey working on this, Neil. The New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance, Ironbound Community Corporation, among others, are really the leaders in that space, and I'm happy to connect you to those folks if needed. Absolutely. All right, so we are at time. I do want to be cautious of folks' time, but thank you again to our amazing panelists. Thank you for all of you for attending this awesome webinar as well. As a reminder, this is the second webinar in a series of webinars with the ultimate goal of preparing the wider movement to engage with Treasury on this 45Y decision related to incineration. We will be sending up a follow-up email with webinar recording, presentations, and any additional information regarding the third webinar series, which again, or the third webinar of this series, which again will be focused on life after incineration and how to embrace a zero waste future. So please stay tuned for that email, and feel free to reach out to us with any questions in the meantime. My email is in the chat, and you can reach it out directly, I believe, do registration as well. So thank you so much for your time. Enjoy the rest of your days, and we hope to see you at our third webinar. Thanks again. Cheers.